Hello. I'm working on the study guide for our bits and pieces, comparing bits and pieces test. I'm looking at page 3, and I'm doing a bunch of questions here that are converting between decimals and fractions, fractions and decimals, and then I'm looking at the grid where we're converting between percents, decimals, and fractions. So I thought it would be good probably to do these all together. So the first one says, rewrite these decimals as fractions. We start off with 0.8. And we learned that the way we say this is 8/10. So this one basically already is. If you say it, is already a fraction. So that would be 8/10. The next one is 0.17. We call that 17/100ths because this is the tenths place, this is the hundredths place, this is 17/100ths. So if we wrote that as a fraction, 17/100ths, that would be how that would look as a fraction. The next one is a negative number, but they work the same way, going from decimals into fractions. We have negative 0.06, and this is in the hundredths place. So we would say this is 6/100ths or negative 6/100ths. So that would be how that would look as a fraction. The next one is negative 2.804. Negative 2.804. Since we have a whole number here, we could write this as a fraction as a whole number as well. So this would be 2 and then this is 804, and this ends in the thousands place. So we would write this as 804 thousandths. And then we would make that negative because this is a negative number. You could write it as 2,804 thousandths. That would be another way that you could write it as an improper fraction. And then our last one is 0.002. And since this is the tenths place, this is the hundredths place, this last number would be the thousandth place. So this would be 2 thousandths. And that's how we would write those as fractions. Now I'm going to take and do the next part, which is taking a fraction and turning it into a decimal. So we start off with 3/4. And we talked about that's kind of a benchmark fraction. It's a fraction that students might already know what that would be as a decimal. But if they're not sure, we learned a strategy of turning it into a fraction out of 100 hundredths, because those are really easy to turn into decimals. So if we did this times 25, because if I multiply the bottom by something, I have to multiply the top by something in order for this fraction to be equivalent. So 4 times 25 would be 100. And 3 times 25 is 75, and 75 hundredths, like we looked at before, could be written as a decimal that looks like this, 0.75, 75 hundredths. The next one is 7/50. Again, using the strategy of trying to change it into a number over 100, 50 times 2 is 100, 7 times 2 is 14, so we could make this into 14 hundredths, which would look like this, 0.14. Then we have negative 13/25. Again, 25 times 4 is 100. So negative 13 times 4. So that would be 40, 52. I think that's right. 52, and this is negative. So it's going to be negative 52 hundredths. That looks like this, 0.52 with a negative sign. Then we have negative 7/10. And this already is a decimal. 7/10 is a decimal. So we would write 7/10 and then make it negative. And then the last one is 5/8. 5/8. Eighths are tricky because it doesn't appear that they can be changed into a decimal out of 100 or a fraction out of 100 or a fraction out of 10. We did learn that eighths are a benchmark fraction, that there is a way to do it, but it might take a few steps. So one of the things that we could do is we could say, well, 5/8 is right between 4/8 and 6/8. And we could say, I know 4/8 is 1/2, and that as a decimal is 0.5 or 0.50. And I know 6/8 is like 3/4, and I know that decimal is 0.75. So we're looking for something that's right in between, right in between. So if I look at, well, what's the difference between these numbers? It's 0.25. So what I really want to know is, what's half of this and then I add it onto here, and that would get me right at what 5/8 is. So this, 0.25, 25 hundredths, if I put a 0 at the end, it'd be a lot easier to find half. So half of 250, 0.125. So if I started here at 0.50 or 0.500 and I added this much, I would be halfway. And if I added another one of these, I would be back over here to 750. So what I want is this place right in the middle. So 0.500 plus this, 0.625. That would be an example of what 5/8 is. 5/8. Students can also do 5 divided by 8. They could do a number like that and divide it by 8 and keep dividing it until they until they ran out of numbers, because it does only go 3 places. So that would be another way that they could find that decimal equivalent. Eighths are numbers that we've talked about as a benchmark. They're numbers that we kind of hopefully will learn what those stand for as decimals. The last section is a big chart, and we're converting between decimals, fractions, and percents. Let's see if I have a better eraser here. So we have this big chart, and it starts off with 62%. So these are all percents. And the middle one is decimals. And the last section are fractions. So we're basically changing. They give us one and we change it to the other. So 62%, we learned percent means out of 100. So 62% is 62 hundredths. That looks like this. And as a fraction, looks like that. The next one, we have the decimal. It's 1.23. So this means 1 and 23 hundredths. So if I wrote that as a fraction, it would be 1 and 23 hundredths. Or I could do 123 hundredths. Either of those would be acceptable. And then I need to write it as a percent. So since I'm looking for out of 100, I would do 123%. The next one I have is 12 fifteenths. So I have a fraction, 12 fifteenths. And again, we have these fifteenths. It doesn't seem obvious how I can convert 15 into 10 or 100. So let me see if I can reduce this fraction and make it into a different fraction. If I divide the top by 3 and the bottom by 3, I get 4 fifths. So this fraction, 12 fifteenths, could also be called 4 fifths. 4 fifths is one that I could more easily move into a decimal or a percent. 5 times 2 is 10, and 4 times 2 is 8. So this would also be known as 8 tenths, which would look like that. And 8 tenths could also be written as 80 hundredths, which would be 80%. The next one we have is 2.65. Again, this is 2 and 65 hundredths. So that would be 2 and 65 hundredths. Or I could do 265 hundredths. Because 2 means I have 200 hundredths plus 65 hundredths would look like that. I like these out of 100 because then that's easy to make that into a percent. Percent means out of 100, so it would be 265%. Then we have 0.55. We call that 55 hundredths, so I would write that as 55 hundredths. And hundredths means percent, so 55 hundredths is 55%. Then we have 48%. So that would be 0.48 or 48 out of 100. And then the last one is 12 tenths. 12 tenths. 12 tenths, we call this an improper fraction because 12 is bigger than 10. That means we have enough for a whole plus 2 tenths left over. So I could write this as 1 and 2 tenths or 1 and 1/5. Or if I wanted to leave it as tenths, I could leave it like that as well as a fraction. But I want to make it into a number that I could easily turn into a number out of 100 or out of 10. Well, it already is out of 10. So 12 tenths would be like 1 and 2 tenths, 1.2. If I wanted to make it out of hundredths, I could also do this, times 10 times 10, it would be 120 hundredths, because I have enough for a whole, plus 20 left over, so I could write this as 120%. So a lot of what we've done in this unit is try to look at different strategies of moving between fractions, decimals, and percents, and understanding how to do that. So I hope that's helpful.